Okay, so welcome everyone. Just a quick reminder to fill out that poll. Right now, it looks like the poll we have a question on, does your state currently sign up workers working in eligible forestry related jobs? And 54% of you say no, and 46% of you say yes. Second question is, have you ever signed up someone for MEP that was working at a sawmill? 6% say yes, so some of you guys are doing that, and 95% say no. And then number 3 is, how comfortable are you determining if a job in forestry or sawmill would be eligible for MEP? 3% of you say very comfortable, 42% say somewhat comfortable, 29% say not at all, and 24% says I do not know. So that's kind of why we're doing this particular webinar. In my own ignorance, I was in a training in Kentucky and someone asked me a question about sawmills and I told them, no, that doesn't qualify. And then they pulled out the guidance and showed me that it did. And so I thought, well, what have I been doing the last, several years? And so wondered why I had missed that and thought, you know what, let's go ahead and share that with everybody in case you're in the same boat that I am. So let me go ahead and get started here and make sure that I have this going right. Okay. All right. So like it says here, this webinar is about the U.S. Forestry industry. It's more than just what's qualifying jobs. We want to give you a little bit of big picture about what's happening so that you can see what's particularly going on, how it works, what you should be looking for in your state. And so I'm going to kind of share a bunch of different things and then also go through the thought process that you need to be thinking about what's qualifying in your particular state. Now, every state, of course, has their own policies. And so we are just going to stick with general guidance. And we do expect that, the best policy is to follow up with your state and figure out what you guys are doing. But we do want to refer back to the guidance on what's allowable. So to start that out, right here, I have a slide that says, what qualifies for MEP. So F9 says related to cultivation or harvesting of trees. So we know that the guidance, the migrant program guidance, has a whole bunch of information. And I don't know, Melissa, if you want to drop into the chat box a link to the guidance, just so if you can find one, just so people know where to find it. If you're not familiar with the guidance, it's a whole bunch of questions that help us know kind of what to do in migrant ed, what's allowable, what's not. And so related to the cultivation and harvesting of trees, on F9, it says, what does cultivation mean in context of trees? So in context of trees, cultivation refers to work that promotes growth of trees. So a lot of us across the country sign up families that work in plant nurseries, that are growing trees. Also can be in the context related to forestry. So what are some examples of work that can be considered cultivation of trees? So it can be, not limited to soil preparation, plowing, fertilizing land, sorting seedlings, planting seedlings, transplanting, staking, watering, removing diseased or undesirable trees, applying insecticides, shearing tops and limbs, tending, pruning, or trimming trees. So these are things that I think we're pretty comfortable. We may associate it a lot with nursery type work. So I imagine if we did the poll about nurseries, most of you would say that you're working with nurseries. But when we start looking at harvesting of trees, let's look at what that looks like. So this is from F11. It says, what does harvesting mean in the context of trees? For the purposes of MEP, harvesting refers to the gathering or taking of trees. What are examples of work that can be considered harvesting? This now is related more to the forestry side. So you've got topping, felling, and skidding. And so that's a lot of the lingo that's related to, those that are out there cutting trees, pulling them down the mountain, really kind of that process of cutting those down, harvesting that. So most of us know that, yeah, this is fine. This is something that we've been working with for a long time. We might not find a lot of workers that are working in that, but we know that that's an eligible work. But then I want you to pay attention to the next one. It says F13, what types of work are not considered part of cultivation or harvesting of trees? So they said it does not, the department believes that the following activities are not part of the cultivation or harvesting of trees. 1, clearing trees in preparation for construction, trimming trees around electric power lines, or cutting logs for firewood. So those are basic, things that most of us would know, hey, this is not an eligible thing. F14, does transporting trees from a harvesting site to a processor, a sawmill, qualify as agriculture work? no, transporting trees is not agriculture work for the purposes of MEP because it occurs after the cultivation and harvesting of trees. So that's similar to other, industries. Once watermelon has been loaded onto a truck and, it's going to be taken somewhere, then that that transporting of that, that watermelon off the farm to another location, of course, would not qualify either. So we can see how the same rules are kind of applied to different industries. Now, the one that I have missed over the years is F15. Is initial processing of trees considered agriculture work? Yes. So you think processing of trees, so that's past just cutting, cutting the tree and felling it. It says yes, because trees are a raw agricultural product. The initial processing of trees is considered agriculture work. So I want you to just think about that. Think about how you use that particular guidance right there in your state. So I'm going to give a little bit of context about the forestry industry so that you know what to look for, what to think about, and then we're going to go into the actual jobs also. So 4%, like it says here, of the national total manufacturing GDP is actually related to forestry products. So United States forest products, it's 4% of our GDP, producing over 200 billion products every year. And so most of us know a lot of products that come from wood. So of course, most of that is not going to be eligible for us. It's only going to be the very beginning part of this process. But you do know that it's used in all sorts of industries. United States is home to a tremendous natural resource. So each one of these slides at the bottom, I have a link. And so if you want to read more, there's a lot more that you can do. And there was a question. We'll pay attention to the questions. If I'm going to answer it a little later on, I will reference that. But we had a question. What if the worker works for private companies? So there are a ton of private companies all over the country that work in forestry, and there's no rule that says that, that wouldn't qualify depending on the job, and we'll go into that. So across the country, here's a good map of a picture of where the forests really are in the country. So like it says here, United States is home to a tremendous natural resource with over 823 million acres of forest and woodlands. So some of you have forestry happening all around you. Some of you are wondering if this is happening, and maybe your area doesn't even have very many trees. But we have different types of forests. It says here, while the country's combined forest and woodland area has been stable to increasing for decades, that doesn't mean forests aren't changing. There's a lot of things that are happening right now that are impacting our forests across the country. So half of the land that's in the United States that's related to forest is privately owned. It says forests and woodlands make up 1/3 of our nation's landscape. More than half of it is privately owned, with most public ownership in the West. And we'll mention in a bit why that's important. National forests make up 19% of the forests and woodlands, although trees on national forests have aged as harvests on public land have declined. And so we have, urban. It says forests are also moving to the city as well. The value of urban trees continues to grow as an economic and public health data show that the trees reduce energy used for heating and cooling by 5.4 billion every year. So you've got shade, you've got a lot of things that are provided. Just a tree does for us, a lot of benefits that it has for us. And it says while producing 67 million tons of oxygen. And so some of you have more trees in your landscape to look out and see. But it's one of the things we want to do is understand what's happening in each one of our areas, and also understanding what policies and what impacts current things are happening on local, national scale that will also impact the forestry in your particular area. And so one of the things, it says like a century ago, our real problem at the time was looking at deforestation, cutting too many trees. They wondered if it was going to really threaten the long haul, the timber supplies that we had. And so like it says here, a century ago, our main forest related problem in the United States was deforestation. Deforestation threatened our timber supplies, our water supplies, our rich forest resources, and our habitat for native wildlife. So these things are still going to be important to think about. Sorry, I have too many phones. It says in response, we set aside protected areas like the national forests and grasslands. Sorry, I'm going to turn this off. It may keep working. Now it won't even turn on. Okay, that is not helpful. So it says, in response, we set aside protected areas like the national forests and grasslands. Even more important, we created sound structures of governance for managing forests sustainably on both public land and private land. So there were some specific laws that were set up. The state parks, the national parks, things like that were starting to be set up. And so that impacts how things are, how things are done right now. It says, today our forest estate is stable, but we faced a host of other issues. Many challenges are associated with drought, wildfire, invasive species, and outbreaks of insects and disease, which are all made worse by the weather and climate change. Warming temperatures mean more energy in the atmosphere, which is consistent with severe weather events, as we all have seen. And so, we've seen these things affect a lot of things. And so we're going to talk about years ago, for example, sorry, I'm all over the place. I'm trying to turn this thing off. Years ago, I worked as a reporter, and one of the things that I had a chance to do was take a little airplane up into the sky and see where they had done a lot of clear cutting in the state of Tennessee. And so you could drive down the interstate and it looked like there were trees all over the place, but it may have been a buffer of maybe 100 yards. And right past that, they had done a ton of clear cutting. And so they would go back and replant the forests with the same kind of tree. And so all the trees would be the same age. And when they did this, they had a huge problem with pine beetles that would come over and just eat all of the trees that had just been planted, or that were, in the same stand of the same years. These trees were all the same age, they were all the same type. And so the state of Tennessee was really looking at different ways that forestry was being done. And so since then, I've kind of paid attention. My husband and I have done some selective cutting on some land that we've had, and just, locally, they've done a lot of clear cutting. And so depending on the area that you're at, you may see different issues and different things that are happening. But this idea of, each area having, different patterns, a lot of the same things are affecting us, but in different ways. So if you're in the West, for example, you've probably seen a lot more wildfires than maybe you have in the East. But around the world, the effects of climate change continue to be felt. And this includes a global decrease in the size of glaciers, a decrease in snow in some areas, warmer oceans, surface temperatures. You all know this. But the changes have impacted the way things are done also at our national forests. And so they continue to see more wildfires that continue to burn in larger areas. They continue to see more pests, more diseases threatening crops and trees. And you may wonder, well, what exactly does this have to do with MEP? So depending on what's happening in your area, they may be doing some cuttings specifically for wildfire purposes, or specifically they may be planting for specific types of trees that they're needing to have in a different area. And so you're going to see different things happening. But these impacts that the weather is having and the climate changes are having, you're going to see that also in the times that they're harvesting and what they're doing. So you're also seeing in the growth of trees. So we've seen, just to hear a few things, that they're looking at the snowpack. When there's less snowpack, there's less water. They're also seeing that plants and animals are moving, the ranges of where these things are growing are moving farther up, or to different areas, and you can kind of see here. Threatened watersheds due to more frequent water shortage, which also can cause more problems and fires. An example is here in Tennessee, we never have very many wildfires. And just 2 weeks ago, we had a wildfire probably about 4 miles from my house. And so they're not equipped at all around here to put out a wildfire. They're, local fire departments can protect structures, but they have no equipment to really be able to just, work in the forest or work in, really rocky, terrain. That's just, we're not even set up. And so that was something that they've had a fire burning now for about 2 weeks that they just don't know how to shut off. And it has been so dry before, the last 2-3 months here, that something that we've never worried about in the past is just right outside my door, probably about 4 miles. And so you never know the changes of how, 6 months of not enough rain can really impact any of us. So Congress has granted the Forest Service since 2017 some additional rights and things that they can do to kind of control and improve our forests. And so in 2017, the Forest Service took these new authorities, embarked on an effort to modernize and align our forest products policies with new realities. So they were looking at kind of what they're going to produce, what they're doing, how they're controlling, what types of work they're doing in these different areas. And so there's been some changes and some things that they've been allowed to do. And so it says here in the middle, kind of understanding how this all goes together. It says the world has almost 10 billion acres of land classified as forest land. The United States has 750 million acres of land. Like we said, 1/3 of that is forest. Of those 750 million acres, about 40% is owned or regulated by either the federal or some state government. Commercial timber harvest is prohibited or severely limited on 1/4 of that land. So some of you live in states where a lot of your timber harvest will be on government land. It will be in state parks or national parks. And some of us live in places where it's absolutely completely prohibited for that to be happening. So one of the things you're going to want to know is what is happening in your state? What does it look like? Where is it allowed to be? Do you have any specific rules? I was in a state, I believe it was Oregon, that I had read that whenever anything is clear cutted, for example, they have to replant. In some states, that's not a law at all. And so it says commercial timber harvest is prohibited on severely or on at least 1/4 of the land, leaving 225 million acres of government-owned land on which harvest may be or is permitted. Another 60% of forest land in the United States is either owned by private landowners or timber companies. So there was a question as far as private companies. There's a bunch of private companies that will harvest their land over multiple years. So each company will do it a little bit different. In the state parks and the national parks, you'll see it done different too. And depending on who you talk to, they'll tell you, one way is better, one way is not the way to go. So here's two different pamphlets that we're talking about clear cutting. One is saying clear cutting is a great way. Another one's saying it's absolutely wrong. And so you're going to have to figure out in your own state whether it's benefiting you or not. But in some places, clear cutting will not be allowed. Some places it will. So when they clear cut, they'll cut everything. And then they'll replant. And one of the disadvantages that they'll say is that when you replant, all of the trees are the same age. So the fire, for example, that we've had a couple miles from here, the older trees have been able to withstand the fire. The younger trees have not. So they're saying, well, the problem is if you cut everything, it's going to take 60 years for it to be back like it was. And you may be able to put some fast growing trees, but they may not be as resistant as those original older trees. And so there's a challenge of, how people are doing these things. And so there may be crews that are moving all over your state to clear cut particular areas, and they're picking up and moving. Some of you have H-2A workers that are working on this. Some of you just have local guys that they work in, clearing land for a long time, and that's what they do. And so it's just every single one of us has a different situation. So then there's also something called selective logging. And so there's a bunch of information in here. I'm just going to mention several things. So there's selective tree cutting, and then there's selective logging. It says at the top, selective tree cutting is often confused with selective logging, which is not the same. Both timber harvesting methods can mean cutting only certain wood. And so you can see here it says selective cutting harvesting means, sorry, I got too many little screens open. Depending on who you're talking to, some of them will say selective cutting will bring the best returns. However, selective cutting removes the stand, particularly with the proper ecosystem balance. So maybe the person's going in and trying to cut only a specific type of tree, that specific size, that maybe after it's dropped all of its seeds. Maybe somebody else is saying, I'm just going to go in and selectively cut everything that's over 16 inches wide, and we're going to cut those and we're going to keep everything else. So just put this in here so that you can figure out when you're working locally and trying to figure out where you might see if there's possible eligible workers. Selective cutting is going to be a little different than clear cutting. The types of things that they're doing, there's going to be someone that needs to go in and mark all these trees, and then they're going to have to, some places they'll allow them to keep the tops. They'll just cut the bottom and leave the top in the forest. Other ones, they have to cut the bottom and take the tops with them. So there's a lot of different reasons why companies may pick one or the other. And so, it says here, this choice, depending if you're doing selective cutting, you could be looking on the diameter, the height, the species, and you're trying to see the value of, what kind of, maybe a specific type of wood is not bringing a lot of value, and so you're not going to mess with that. But you're going to selectively go in, and the idea is that in 10, 12 years, there could be other trees that could also be ready to selective log. And so that's one way that you might see what's going to happen. So it says here, selective cutting versus other forest management practices. There's this idea of are you trying to keep things sustainable? Are you trying to make sure that the forest is still there when you leave, or are you going to try to regrow this particular area all over again? And so, you can kind of see, depending on, where you're working, who you're working with, what's happening in your area, there's going to be different types of, selective cutting that they're doing. There's a lot of discussion as far as what's the best way to be environmentally friendly, which is better, selective logging or clear cutting. So some experts believe that selective cuts support forest regeneration because younger trees get more sunlight to grow and pathogens get more sunlight to be destroyed. Regeneration after clear cut starts either naturally or by replanting in a couple of years. However, the next timber harvest after clear cuts will be possible on average after 60 years. So that's just clearing out a whole area and starting all over again. And so I've got a couple comments. It says they don't take the tops with them as entire tops. They chip them. It's biomass. So Sarah, that's completely different every single area. And so she's saying, I'm assuming that chipping will be like qualifying. It's like cutting a chicken into the thighs, leg size, and breast. I think that would be a state decision. And so every state is different. Like, for example, in Tennessee, a lot of times they leave the tops right there. They'll selective log and they'll leave the top, and you can just tell that they did logging because all the tops that are left. In other places, they require them. Maybe the landowner says, if you're going to come, you have to take the tops. And so you would have to decide if someone is, doing the chipper right there to, as part of the job, is that an eligible activity or not? So very good question right there. So there's a lot of controversy as far as which is better. I'm just going to throw a few things for you to be thinking about, more in the idea for you to understand the industry. And so if you're talking to someone and trying to figure out what they're doing, you can kind of, see the types of jobs that might be related to that. So it says clear cutting allows logging many trees at once. So they can come in at all different sizes. And so it can be really good for time management reasons. So if I'm, an owner, I can get a lot done. I don't have to go and try to move, make sure that this big, huge tree is not messed up because I'm only going to get this one instead. And so there's a lot of logistics that can go into how things are cut. But other people will just say, I want the land clear cut. And so it's just going to be depending on what you're seeing. Most of, some of the national forests, you'll see that they'll clear cut certain areas, and in other states, they won't clear cut at all. They'll only do selective cutting. Or in states that are worried about wildfires, they'll be doing specific cutting to be able to make sure that the area is not as susceptible to wildfires. So there's another one there's a lot of other things that they talk about, but there is shelterwood, seed tree, and selective cutting. And so a seed tree, this is another way that they do it, where they'll look at the tree and see when it's going to drop its seeds, and they'll make sure that there are other saplings around before they cut the big tree. And so shelterwood practice provides some shadow protection for sun intolerant species, and then mature trees are cut after 5 to 10 years. So all of these methods are selective in their nature, but the difference between them is the timber choice. Seed tree and shelterwood practices promote this idea of forest revival, that the forest will be able to come back quickly, while most selective cutting harvests are really looking at the most expensive timber. What's the one that's going to bring the most value? So personally, my husband and I had some land that we cut some of the trees on there when we first bought it, and we looked for specific size of trees to look if there would still be some in 10 years of that same one. And then we also had to look at if there were saplings that were around that would replace it, or if we only left the pines, for example, then later on that would be all that's growing. So you want to make sure that you have a good balance. But again, that's the preference of the owner or whoever's doing the cutting. And so you would want to know that in your own area. So a few things to think about for selective cutting. They have to mark the trees. They have to calculate the timber volumes. They have to look at the areas that they're covering. They have to figure out how to get the equipment in for these particular types of, where they're going to cut. They could decide to do a whole section together. They can decide to just do one or two. They have to figure out how to drop those trees and not mess up the other ones. And then they may, some of them actually will apply a herbicide so that some of the saplings can compete better against the older trees. And so I included this in just so you could think about jobs that were related to specifically selective cutting. So they're trying to look at this. Sometimes they'll want a specific species to really thrive. And so they may take, some of the others that are competing with it. And then there's this idea of group selective cutting. So they get everything in a particular area and then replant just that area. And so you can kind of see just the logistics that would be related to that. And then sometimes other ones are specifically just saying, you know, I'm going to do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, depending on what's going on. So says what is reduced impact selective logging. This is another way that they do it. So it's a sustainable timber harvest method and forage management to mitigate environmental negative impacts. It combines selective logging and directional tree felling, as well as constructing trails and roads as narrow as possible to lead to the least disturbance and damage to nature. So depending on, you know, what you're seeing, in some states I've seen where they've cut the whole entire mountain off. And so then they're going to replant that. It looks very different depending on, you know, each area. And so I just want to give you a little bit of background so that you know what to say and what to, you know, when you're asking questions. So a few other advantages they say as far as selective cutting is, it just mentioned before, it provides light. There are some trees that will never grow very good because they're being shaded too much. And so they're looking at the next stand of trees that would come up good as long as they had more light. Boost seed growth in cleared up areas, leave some valuable trees for future logging, prevents forest fires. So in some of the forest fire prevention, they're literally going in and cutting out some of those extra trees so that it's, you know, the fires won't spread as fast. And then it produces no smoke and air pollution issues by prescribed burning. So that's another thing. Instead of logging in some areas or doing selective cutting, sometimes they just do prescribed burnings. And so, you know, trying to control a wildfire, just down the road from me where it's happening, they've started several prescribed burns, except we're new at this and doesn't seem like they know what they're doing. And so some of those burns have gotten out of control. But in states that really know, they're used to this, they may do a burn to slow down the fire. And so sometimes they'll say, well, so we don't have to do a bunch of burns, let's just thin the forest and that'll help us in the future. So somebody's doing those jobs. And so we want to know, are those kind of jobs the jobs that are eligible for us or not? And so we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Something else to have on your radar. This is a website that you can access. It's called, let me see if I can just drop it in the chat box. If it'll work. Yeah, let me put this in the chat box. It's a huge, if I can get the whole site. Maybe I can, maybe not. Let's see if I can get a smaller one. Okay, so I'm going to put this in the chat box and see if I can share my screen from here so you can kind of see it. And if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat box, because some of you, if you raise in your hand, the best place is to put that in the box. So this particular site shares kind of what's happening with the forests across the world. Are they increasing? Are they decreasing? And it was really kind of a fascinating slide to come across, information to come across here, that you can see where there has been gains in tree cover and losses in tree cover. And so this means where there's been a lot of forestry or fires, or the South, there has been a ton of clear cutting and selective cutting. And you can see that, you know, the difference in, if you were to press the button, let me share, took me to this little slide here. It'll let you see what's happened between, you know, years and how much trees. It says tree cover loss. And so you can kind of see some of your states have not really been impacted by it. And some of yours has. And so in most of the places that have been impacted by this loss, it's usually been due to forestry, and so, or due to if there was a large scale like weather disaster, that like a hurricane, things like that. So you can see here, just looking at one particular state in Georgia, it just looks at the increase and decrease in tree cover. Just there, you can look at your state. It says USA lost a lot of forest. There are plans for recuperation of those hundreds of trees that lost. There are plans for recuperation. So a lot of this is private land too. So I think that it's something that is, you know, depending on those processes that they're using for logging. If they're just clear cutting, of course, it's going to take a while for that all to grow, and it may never grow back to what it was. You may not have the same kind of trees. And so right now, this is something that, as I was kind of researching for this, it was making a lot of sense. And sometimes where it looks at, you know, trees we'll look at the value of trees here in just a second. But as temperatures rise, trees are one of those things that help bring it down. And so just kind of interesting to look at that. The southeastern states are losing trees super fast. It says the southeastern United States is losing trees between 2000 and 2012. trees in the region were cut up 4 times faster than South American rainforests. And there was a comment from this particular article where the man that they were talking to said, in the southeastern US, what's driving the loss of forest cover is industrial scale logging. So a lot of, depending on what's happening in your state, there has been a lot of large scale forestry logging that's been happening. And so it says rainforests are often clear cut for agriculture, whereas trees down in the southeast are usually replanted, but it may take several years. Like Wilson said, it may take 20 years. And depending on the kind of tree, maybe 20 years for one and maybe 60 for another. And so they're looking now at how much carbon a tree can absorb. And so you can kind of, look at what's happening with that. It says absolutely older standing trees have more benefit for the climate. So you can actually use that tool that we put into the chat box and look at it and see a particular region and kind of what's happening with it and where it's going. So just kind of something for you to look at. States that have lost the most tree cover, California would be the top, then Oregon, then Colorado, then South Carolina, and then Maine, Mississippi, Louisiana, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, Alabama, Arizona. So you can kind of see a lot of that's due to logging that's currently happening in your states, or a few of you, it's more due to climate and things like that. It says climate change has contributed to beetle outbreaks in many Western states. Winter cold is no longer limiting the bark beetles, resulting in beetle infestations on a massive scale. That can be a real problem when you plant only the same tree, if that was your plan to grow afterwards. On the national forests alone, the area has reached almost 13 million hectares. In California alone, that is an estimated 66 million dead trees. So then you have the drought, which weakens the trees, making them unable to fight off the beetle attack. And it says it's tempting to think of drought as temporary, but in the area of climate change, that's wishful thinking. One expert put it this way: you can't call it a drought anymore because it's going over to a drier climate. No one says that the Sahara is in drought. So it's just something to kind of think about, all the impacts on that. So of course, we're looking at this for eligibility, but we also need to understand all of these different things that are happening in this area. So we're going to look at a few things related to climate change and how that's impacting different parts of the country. Let me see if we got any comments over here. Okay, so I think I've already answered most of those. It says climate experts, basically, climate exerts a major influence on the productivity, distribution, composition, and structure of forests. Temperatures are increasing globally, and these widespread temperature increases are resulting in local changes in temperature, precipitation, and extreme weather events. Changes have varied by region, and many of these regional differences will continue in the coming decades. So the Western United States is experiencing an increase in drought, wildfire, and mountain pine beetle. And so that, of course, directly impacts those trees. In the Midwest and East, we've had heavy rain events and decreased winter severity that have altered basically what's happening in our forests. And they've had range shifts for trees and biological stressors. The East Coast is experiencing rising sea levels that threaten coastal forests with flooding and increased salinity. And this region could also be subject to more severe hurricanes and other tropical storms in the future. So it also is affecting how forests are being managed. So it's reducing the windows of opportunity to do those prescribed burns, to harvest, and to necessitate changes in timing of those activities. Direct and indirect effects of climate change on the nation's forests will influence the benefits they provide, such as timber and non-timber forest products, recreational opportunities. So we're seeing these things, we're seeing these differences depending on where we are. And it's just something that we very much want to pay attention. So one of the things they're trying to look at now is how do we make sure that they're more resilient? What can we do now with our forests? What kind of trees do really well in drought? What kind of, how do we need to change things? And so there's been a lot of studies that are specifically looking at how to manage things on the large scale, how to manage the fires, how to create low density forests that can really be able to thrive even with all these challenges that are happening right now. So we're seeing, sharing all this just to say that your area, things are changing. We're seeing, depending on where you're at, the challenges that your particular area is facing is going to be different. You want to learn that. And so they're looking at this idea of in more places of prescribed fires. and to really make sure that the forest can withstand. And so, you're going to see that depending on, different places that you're at. Then there's another thing called salvage logging. And so it says post-fire logging or salvage logging is the practice of cutting and removing dead or damaged trees after a large natural disturbance, such as a wildfire. So this actually happens. This is a specific type of logging where they'll come in and salvage anything that's left. And so this is something that happens a lot in the West, and it's used to recover that economic loss. And, if there's any burned timber that can still be used, and then they clear that out to be able to plant. And so that also could be a job that you're kind of looking to try to see if something is happening related to that in your area. So then there's the idea of replanting. You can actually look in, there are a lot of H2B workers that come specifically for this. It says some forests do not need to be replanted after some types of fire. For example, the lodgepole pine, aspen, and oak can regenerate naturally after a high severity fire, while shortleaf and longleaf pines have prolific natural regeneration after low severity or prescribed fire. So just understanding that the intensity of the fire would determine whether it needs to be replanted or whether it doesn't, because some of them will actually send out their seeds on that, during a really intense fire, and some will not make it. And so depending on what's happening, that's the kind of jobs that are needed. So here is a picture of an H2B visas basically workers that were working in Montana's national forest. And then they also will work in Medford, Oregon. And so you can kind of see that, these are current things that are happening right now. There are plenty of H2B workers that are coming to work in forestry. So let's see if I'm missing any of your questions. Okay. It says there are 9,434 forestry workers, many of whom work on public lands adjacent to Western communities with soaring unemployment rates. So you can kind of see that right now we are bringing in workers. And it says here, this is just till 2018. And so I couldn't find anything to right now, but it had gone up 77%, the number of H2B guest workers in forestry occupations. And so something definitely to think about. And so some of them are doing that replanting that we saw them all over Tennessee, that they would come in and replant. And so it says that a lot of times that replanting is absolutely essential, or it's going to take 60 years for anything to even grow right there. So lots and lots of benefits that we have because of trees, lots of challenges right now. Another thing that you have to think about is the species that live in those particular forests. Sometimes logging can't be done because there is an endangered species that's living in a particular area, and so you can't cut there. And so they have a project that looks at woodpeckers. This is out in the West Coast, where they found that certain birds were only able to thrive in certain areas, and so they were trying to figure out how to figure out where the birds were, so to make sure that when they did salvage logging that they weren't impacting some of the animals that were there also. And so just kind of something that a lot of them have to think about. Now, you're probably wondering what's happening in your state. These are some of the largest lumber producing states. So we've got Oregon, Washington, Georgia, Alabama, California, Arkansas, Mississippi, Idaho, North Carolina, and Texas are some of the top lumber producing states. You can see in some of these right here, this is kind of that area that we saw, your South Carolina, your Georgia. That was one of the areas we saw a lot of the loss of that, tree, that one map that we're showing over time of the, the trees. And we can see that a lot of that is due to the lumber that's being produced there. So there also is let me put this in the chat box. So if you're wondering where on earth, because we haven't talked much about sawmills, we're getting ready, we're going to talk in just a little bit about, how to figure out the job. So the easy ones are the ones, the cutting, the felling, and all of this, but they're also the harvesting of trees also qualifies. So I was trying to figure out where we could find, a listing of the sawmills. And so there is a sawmill database. And so you can go in and look at some of these different companies and see where their sites are in your particular state. And so let me go ahead and back to where it was. I'm going back to where it was. Okay. So there was a comment that says, I looked at the NRG, and if we read this portion, what is the definition of agriculture work? Agriculture work is the initial processing of raw products, as well as harvesting trees. Okay, so this person was sharing the same thing we talked about a little bit earlier. Okay, so let me go back to my slides. Make sure I'm sharing the right thing. Okay, so make sure, I feel like I'm not sharing this. Yes. Okay, so here's an example of when you click on that, sawmills, you'll be able to see, it'll give you the information as far as where Georgia Pacific, it'll show you a map of where those particular places are, and you can see if any of those are in your area. And so I just wanted to give you a resource to be able to start looking and seeing. So now let's go back into context and figure out, okay, if we have sawmills, because we've talked a little bit about the different types of work that's in, that's related to, forestry and cutting trees. We have to remember that there are easy ones that we talked about earlier, transplanting, staking, watering, removing disease ones. Those are all things that we can see. But now we're going to look at the actual initial processing of trees. And so it says, again, reminder, yes, trees are a raw. Is initial processing of trees considered agriculture work? Yes, because trees are a raw agriculture product. The initial processing of trees is considered agricultural work. So I borrowed this little picture from my colleague Bruce Lack out in Michigan. We were on a training call the other day, and I thought it was really appropriate for this. So let's look at this thought process of what would be initial processing. So you can kind of look at this slide here and see that, when the logs come in, they may go through a debarking process, then they may be sawed into logs, and then they can be sorted and stacked and maybe dried. And so the challenge that you're going to have is to be able to see, okay, where does this initial processing stop? What is no longer going to be eligible for my state? And so as IDRC, we're not going to make that determination for you, but I would suggest that you look at other industries and how you handle this. So a chicken, for example, when a chicken comes into a chicken processing facility, do you just have the beginning chicken, the ones that are just messing with it before the feathers come off and before they start cutting? Or where do you stop that process? And so if you are still, taking the feathers off and then they're cutting it into different pieces of chicken, and you go all the way until it gets breaded or, put in right before it starts getting another ingredient added to it, look at that same process with the processing, with the harvesting and processing of trees. And so, you could take a look at an easy one would be going all the way. You still have the tree, it still looks like a tree, and then it goes through debarking, and then it gets cut up into pieces. And so some of you may say that is the exact end. As soon as it becomes a board, it's no longer eligible. So stacking and sorting might not be eligible. You're going to have to make that determination. And so obviously, once it's no longer a tree and it's another product, then of course they wouldn't be eligible for us. But we are suggesting that as a state, you make your policy to figure out where in this process, does it qualify? And so we just sent out a question on our monthly scenarios that mentioned loading logs at a forestry site where they were just cut into a tree, into the truck. And so would that be eligible or not? And so we know some states would qualify that, some are not sure. So we ask you to really look at this and determine in your state, where is that process? But sawmill work, although, like I said, for a long time that we were thinking, no, it wouldn't be eligible. Not every worker at a sawmill is going to be temporary, but some of you do have, mills in your state that very much would still be parts of the jobs would be considered part of that initial processing. And so we wanted to make sure that we were putting some information out there to really look at what's happening and look at the different types of cutting that's happening, the different types of work that's happening in the forest. Also to realize that there are a lot of workers, new workers that are specifically coming for this. And then there's a lot of different, management, forestry management that's happening that used to not be happening. So you want to be aware of what's currently happening in your state. So just to put it in the chat box here, get your thoughts. Where would you guys say initial processing would stop? And again, this is subject to your state policy, but I would like to see people's thoughts. If you want to throw it in the chat box, where would you say? Would you stop at debarking? Would you go all the way to sawing? Would you go, what would you do? Sarah said, I'd say drying is equivalent to cooking that chicken. Okay. So she says, okay, I'm going to take these particular spots. Esther says she would stop at debarking. So just to play devil's advocate there, I could say, if you thought of that thought process, you might say, well, that's the chicken. As soon as they take the feathers off, it's now a raw chicken. So would you go farther with that? So we've got more comments. One says, I would stop at sorting and stacking. Israel said stop at delivery. Israel, would you say stops at delivery, like taking it out from the sawmill, or delivery to the sawmill? Giselle says stop at stacking. Norma says drying. And so Sarah says I'd stop a pudding. She's into drying. One says adjusting and sorting. Drying. I would say stop at drying from the sawmill. Okay. Drying, sorting, and stacking. So this is the challenge that we all have. You want to make sure in your state that it can be a real challenge to find migrant families. You want to make sure that if there is a particular area that you should be expanding or looking into, this might be one of those areas. And as you can see, you're going to need to make sure that you have a process and that you have a policy. It says, I would consider the sawing as processing, but I can be persuaded. Okay, so yeah, so you can see some of you are saying you would stop at the sawing, but you can also see that some of your other colleagues might say, we're going to stop at the drying. And so just that shows the nature of the importance of your own state policies. And we want to make sure that, that everyone's really aware of where our parameters are. And we also don't want to set parameters that we don't need to for you guys. That is the state decision on how you're going to do that. But we do have in the guidance that we can have some of that initial processing there. And Wilson says the bark is always worse than the bite. Yes, that's true. So questions, comments, thoughts on this, anything that we've shared so far about the forestry industry. I hope this has been helpful. For me, it's always helpful to look at the industry itself, look at the challenges that are happening, looking at how they do things, why they do things a certain way, how things may change by region. And so that was kind of our thought process to say what's currently happening. So if you have national forests in your state, you want to know what's happening there. Is there logging that's going on? And if there is, who's doing that work? The picture that I showed of the H-2A workers, those were specifically to work at a national park. So you may think, well, those are national parks. There wouldn't be any workers there. Some of you have crews that travel all over the place to replant. So you want to know who they are and what they're doing. So you really want to be aware of those things in your particular state. So let me go on. So next month, we're going to do a few of these industry things for this month, for the next couple months. We've had a lot of questions about what's happening in the hemp. And so next month, we're going to specifically look at what's happening with the hemp industry, how things have changed. So we have a comment here that says, I think it's important that we come up with some common standards. While I know that IDRC isn't the boss, that's OME. If we begin to sign folks up in sawmills, some general agreement would be helpful. This is from Vermont, that we had to prove to OME that their work could be temporary and qualified. Okay, so another question, what are the time for this type of work, and could it happen at certain times of the year? So Sarah, this can happen at all different times of the year. A lot of times, just depending on what's happening, if you're out in the West, there might be certain times that they're doing a lot of forest management and prevention for forest fires. If you're up in other parts of the country, it may just when the private owner decides that they want to have the land cut. It can really completely be, this is something that can go on throughout the year. Most of that work is very temporary because they're going in and just, working for a particular amount of time to do that particular job. Now, sawmills, as long as there are enough sources of lumber coming in your state, and those are open usually year round, they do ebb and flow depending on the places. Tennessee has a lot of small sawmills. And when I first started working in Migrant, I thought they qualified, but this was before these rules. And I visited a whole bunch of them, and they had a lot of workers that came in and went. And so I think you'll just have to figure out what's happening in your particular state. Let's see if I can see any more questions. Now, Melissa, can you do me a favor and throw in, well, let me see. I'm going to go ahead. Hold on, one more thing. I'm going to add this in. I'm going to add this in the chat box. If anyone wants to register for our upcoming webinar on hemp, you can go ahead and do that. And I'm also going to put in the chat box our survey. We always have to put this out, but I would suggest if you guys want any more in-depth about specific industries, let us know how we did today, but also let us know if there are particular topics that you're interested in learning about in the future. We do use those evaluations to see how we did, but also to see if there are particular things that we need to share. And we will email out to all participants of the webinar the slides and also the recording of this. So one final thing, we are going to start each month on our newsletters. We've been doing the scenarios and sending them out. And interestingly enough, when we send the scenarios and we have you guys put responses, the responses, we're all over the page with our responses on whether someone's eligible or not on these scenarios. So we're going to do a monthly, maybe 10-minute video that just kind of walks through each scenario. And so you can sign up for these if you want them to, in our newsletter. You can, if you don't get our newsletter, go ahead and sign up here, and we'll start sending those out on the 15th of each month. You'll get the response back for that, and then you can also get that video if you want to see why we think something's eligible or not eligible. And so we hope that is helpful. So let us know how we did, and we very much appreciate your time, and thank you for joining us today. I'll go ahead and stop the recording.